Picture this. A column of 170 men is wading through freezing water that reaches past their waists in the middle of nowhere in February, with no food left and miles of icy swamp still ahead of them. Some of them can barely stand. A few have to be carried by their friends. A small drummer boy is floating on top of his own drum just to keep from drowning. And leading them first into the water every single morning is a 26-year-old redhead from Virginia with gunpowder smeared across his face like war paint. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is one of the most insane, most overlooked victories in American history. And by the end of it, you will understand why almost nobody remembers his name. Back in the 1760s, if you had asked anyone in rural Virginia about a boy named George Rogers Clark, they would have shrugged. He was just another planter's son. Tall for his age, red-haired, not particularly interested in books. He was born in November of 1752, not far from where Thomas Jefferson grew up, the second of 10 children in a family that would eventually send 5 sons off to fight in the Revolution. His youngest brother, William, born when George was already a teenager, would one day walk into the history books alongside Meriwether Lewis. But George himself was never the classroom type. He was restless. He wanted to be outside, moving, exploring, and his grandfather noticed it and taught him how to survey land, a skill that mixed math with raw wilderness instinct. By 19, that restlessness had turned into direction. Clark paddled down the Ohio River into Kentucky, sleeping on riverbanks, mapping land that most Virginians had never even heard of, let alone seen. This was land the King of England had technically forbidden colonists from settling on, a line drawn after the French and Indian War, telling everyone to stay east of the mountains. Clark, naturally, ignored it completely. Over the next few years, he learned that wilderness better than almost any other white man alive, fought as a militia captain in a brutal war against Shawnee warriors, and built a reputation as someone men were willing to follow into danger without hesitation. By 1776, that reputation mattered more than ever, because Kentucky was under siege. The British, operating out of Fort Detroit, were arming Native American war parties and sending them against isolated frontier settlements. Cabins burned. Families were killed or taken captive. Settlers started calling 1777 the year of the Bloody Sevens, because the violence never let up. Behind much of it was a British officer nicknamed the Hair Buyer, a man who paid bounties for American scalps and prisoners delivered back to Detroit. While everyone else on the frontier was building higher walls and bracing for the next raid, Clark was thinking about something nobody else was considering: attack. He sent spies deep into British-held Illinois territory and got back exactly the information he was hoping for. The British had pulled most of their real soldiers east to fight the main war, leaving their western forts thinly guarded by mostly French-speaking civilians who had zero loyalty to the crown. Clark rode back to Virginia, pitched the plan to the governor and a council that included Thomas Jefferson, and got the green light. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and told to raise 350 men. Here is where the plan should have fallen apart immediately, because after 3 years of brutal war, almost nobody wanted to volunteer for anything. Clark ended up with a little over half the men he needed. No uniforms, no artillery, just guts. On June 24th, 1778, instead of waiting for reinforcements that were never coming, Clark loaded his ragtag militia into boats and pushed off down the Ohio River. He marched them 120 miles through trackless summer wilderness with no roads and no resupply. And on the night of July 4th, exactly 2 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, they reached the village of Kaskaskia. They slipped through the streets in total darkness, captured the sleeping French commander in his own bed, and took the entire town without firing a single shot. Then Clark did something almost as clever as the capture itself. He let the terrified French villagers stew in fear for hours before revealing that France had just allied itself with the American cause and watched the entire town flip to his side within minutes. For a while, it actually looked like Clark had pulled off a miracle with barely any bloodshed. But that peace didn't last. When the British commander at Detroit heard what happened, he marched south with roughly 600 men, retook the fort at Vincennes in December of 1778, and settled in to wait out the winter, confident that nobody would be crazy enough to attack him through the flooded plains surrounding his position. He sent most of his native allies home for the season and kept a garrison of about 90 men, fully expecting a quiet few months before finishing the job in spring. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also completely wrong. A Spanish merchant who had escaped British custody made his way to Clark in January of 1779 and laid out everything: the size of the enemy garrison, the state of the fort, and the enemy's plan to crush Clark's remaining forces once the weather improved. Clark understood immediately that waiting was not an option. If he gave the British time to regroup and gather their native allies again, Kentucky would fall, and everything he had already bled for would be erased. So he decided to do the one thing his enemy considered flatly impossible. He was going to march nearly 200 miles through flooded wilderness in the dead of February and take the fort back before anyone even knew he was coming. What followed was one of the most brutal marches in American military history. It rained almost every single day. The men waded through standing water for miles at a time. Provisions ran out fast, and hunting parties came back empty-handed because the flooded landscape had scattered all the game. By the time they reached one swollen river, it had spread into a channel 5 miles wide. They built canoes, ferried men across in shifts, and kept moving even as they went days without eating. Clark held the whole operation together through sheer force of personality, cracking jokes, organizing marching contests between companies, and making absolutely sure he was the first man into the freezing water every single morning, no exceptions. The worst moment came when they reached a flooded plain stretching 4 miles wide, standing between them and the fort. The men slept that night on a tiny patch of high ground with empty stomachs and woke up with their clothes literally frozen to their bodies. Clark understood that if he didn't get them moving immediately, some of them were going to die right there on that scrap of wet earth. So he stood up, gave a speech nobody bothered to write down, but everybody remembered for the rest of their lives, smeared gunpowder across his face, let out a war cry, and walked straight into the ice. He broke through the frozen surface with his bare fists. One by one, his men followed him in. When they finally reached the outskirts of the town that evening, exhausted, starving, and half frozen, Clark pulled off one final piece of theater. He had his men unfurl every flag and scrap of colored cloth they owned and march back and forth behind a small rise in the land, appearing and disappearing over and over, creating the illusion of an army several times larger than it actually was. The townspeople watched from their windows, convinced a massive American force had arrived, and not a single person warned the British commander inside the fort. Clark's riflemen, some of the best marksmen on the entire continent, took cover behind the surrounding houses and poured such accurate fire through the fort's gun ports that the defenders couldn't even open them to fire back. By the next morning, the British commander who had once bought scalps for bounty walked out of that fort and surrendered unconditionally to a 26-year-old militia colonel who hadn't lost a single man in the fight. That victory kept the American flag flying over a stretch of territory that would later become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. Land historians say effectively doubled the size of the original 13 colonies once the war officially ended. And yet, the country he handed that land to never really paid him back. Virginia buried his war debts in committee for years. Creditors seized his property, and he spent his final decades in near obscurity, eventually losing a leg and suffering strokes that left him bedridden until his death in 1818. There is one image of Clark that says everything about who he actually was, and it has nothing to do with politics or debt or the decades of neglect that followed. It's him standing chest deep in freezing water, ice cracking around him, his exhausted men watching from the bank, trying to find the courage to follow. He didn't give a speech about honor or destiny. He smeared black powder across his face, screamed into the wind, and simply walked in first. That was the whole philosophy in one motion. Lead from the front, always, no matter the cost. If this story hits you the way it hit us, think about which other forgotten figure from history deserves to have their story told properly. Because George Rogers Clark is proof that some of the most important people in our past never got the credit that history owed them.